Uh, Thanks for your introduction. You may know that in conferences there's always this quarrel, what is the worst time possible during the day to talk or to listen? And some people say it's just before lunch because, you know, the blood sugar level goes down very fast, and so people get more nervous and nervous for the lunch. Others claim that the worst time is after lunch because you have this famous postprandiale Müdigkeit, postprandial fatigue, or the Germans also call it Suppenkoma. You know. So this is what we are in, and we have no choice. We are 35 minutes late. I hope we can speed up a bit, and I'm sure that our presentations and the debate about it is going to wake us up, all of us. So please, Balázs, it's your turn. I don't know whether you have had the chance to look at the paper. I had no, so all of us who have not yet had the chance have the surprise party to listen and for the first time see what we get to know. Please.
Thank you so much. And I actually just realized that nobody's seen the points which I prepared, so apologize for that. I did share with the organizers, but seems like didn't get through. So indeed, it's going to be a little bit of surprise, but I don't think for most of the fellows this year is going to be too much surprise what they're going to say. My focus in the past 10 months have been mostly, overwhelmingly, or even exclusively the war and its impact over Europe as well as on the neighborhood. But the entire research and the paper which I'm preparing now has various parts. And here what you can see, the title, War as a Solution, I put a question mark, but it's certainly going to be the cover of the first part of the research, which is focusing on internal and external factors leading to war. And in the end, these factors, which I'm not going to go deeply into this now because we're not going to have time, were pointing into war as a solution, obviously, by a choice for Russia. And I do believe that this is an important to make sure that we do understand those internal as well as external factors which were leading into this. The other part is obviously how the war is going on, Russia's invasion for 16, or it's actually we had in the 17th months. But I'm also not going to go into this. I'm dealing with a few scenarios potentially, but what I would like to keep the focus currently, also because I have two excellent colleagues who are experts on those exactly, is the overall implications of the war, as well as particularly on the implications for the Eastern Europe, the EU, as well as the neighborhood policy per se. So the first thing which I want to say is, and for those who are here, I'm happy to share these talking points. Perhaps it's going to be interesting. So the first, what I see the key trends or the overall implications are, number one, and sorry, my first thesis, and it's not in the title, War as a Solution for the first part, but actually I would argue the main thesis is that we are at the breaking point. Based on those overall implications. So why? First of all, I see a decoupling. And the Russian invasion only reinforced the previous trend, started with the NATO enlargement, proceed with COVID, and a couple of other factors which, you know, we have seen a divided world in Europe. And the war ended. Two major processes both started in the 70s, at least de facto or structurally. One is the German Ostpolitik from the Willy Brandt time, and which was underpinned by the German-Russian Energy Corporation. I think it's a very abrupt end. It's very nicely in a bracket characterized by the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline. The second, and perhaps we should also focus more on that, is essentially the end of the neoliberal economic policy, which was also started exactly in the 70s, So we're talking about a 50 years old process going into an end, both in Europe as well as globally. For those, I'm highly recommend, for interested in the second one, highly recommend Jake Sullivan's speech for about a month ago at the Brookings Institute. Now Western media is picking it up, started to write about Biden economics, if I'm not mistaken, and correcting, using the correct spelling. But essentially, due to national security reasons, the US de facto ending up the free trade policies, which is, by the way, having a huge repercussions for Europe as well as for the US-EU relations, which I'm going to talk a little bit about in the end. So these are the two large implications. There's a couple of other processes which I think there is now the debate is on whether this is happening or not. Number one is deglobalization. I have no particular opinion. I think it has actually started already during COVID. And the war obviously have an impact on that. I don't want to go into the details. The second is de-dollarization, which I think it's going to be largely remaining more as a wishful thinking based on data, although obviously the process has been kicked off because of the war as well as the Western reaction, the sanctions, and using the global financial instruments against Russia. So that's number one, the decoupling is point number one. Point number two, there is a situational power shift within the EU toward the East. The debate is still on, particularly in Poland as well as in Eastern Europe, but certainly now national security and security emotions, and how the Baltic states see the security situation is really dominating in the past 16 or 17 months. Of the war, I'm calling it situational shift. It's not a structural shift yet. But obviously, both France and Germany has to react. The Zeitenwende, as well as now Macron's speech at the GlobSec conference in Bratislava, is a clear-cut case that the big Western European nations and countries cannot disregard this. At the same time, we also have to say that there is a cliche that the war reformed or re-energized Western unity. Indeed, that is true, but under the surface, there is a lot of cracking economic, social, and political factors, which from a longer term or mid-term perspective are actually pointing into disunity. And point number three, point number three here is de-risking. Obviously I'm pointing to China as well as the relationship with China. This is also something which is threatening the Western unity the most. The relationship of the US-China relationship as well as the US-EU relationship is fundamentally different. And the question is, in case of confrontation, what would happen? In the US-EU relationship, there's a number of factors: trade, economic policy. I already mentioned the shift in the US when it comes to overall global economic policy. This shift has not been going through the EU. The EU is still very much trying to protect free market and free trade as much as possible, as evident even vis-a-vis the EU approach toward Ukraine and the neighborhood. But also trade and subsidies, the very different policies around subsidies are giving a large advantage to the US. And given, here the difference between the West and the rest is going to be growing, I think we're talking about the US-EU relationship in these terms as a key factor. Now, very quickly turning into implications on the Eastern neighborhood, and I will focus most on Eastern Europe, and I'm leaving Caucasus for Tom Deval and his presentation for tomorrow. But here I think the policy itself as well as the region is broken. The EU already previously divided the Eastern Partnership countries into two groups. Those who are having the association and now the membership, the integration path, as well as those who don't. Now the war has really stepped in and break literally these countries, Ukraine, Moldova, clearly on the integration path. Georgia, I'm calling it secluding. Russia is putting a nuclear stamp on Belarus. And the implications of the war, I think, is going to be the longer the war, the bigger this a break between East and West is going to be. I think this is also one of the things, I've been talking to Natalie Tocci a lot during the fellowship about that. The realization must be coming for the EU that we have a responsibility for those countries, particularly talking about Ukraine and Moldova, simply because we contributed to the process. And even though it was clearly Russia starting the war, our policies contributed to the situation where we are, and that's kind of shifting the responsibility on us as well. Here, I already emphasized the situational shift. There is no structural shift yet. I have also a saying that, I putting what the EU does into two categories, the symbolic and the tangible. And mostly what we see vis-a-vis Ukraine, but also to Moldova, is symbolic. I do think Moldova and Ukraine is going to get moving into the integration process because the EU, the Commission, is still considering it, as well as the member states, as symbolic. At the same time, the structural thinking and the structural shift must come if the tangible would be coming in, meaning really these countries would be integrated. That means internal reform. Just giving you one example, the common agricultural policy and Ukraine integration is not compatible whatsoever. The EU also is struggling to find money for Ukraine. Those who are following the Ukraine and Recovery Conference, it was clearly stating, that there is no source. The EU budget is broken as well, by the way, also because of Ukraine, largely, as well as the connected migration. And the cost of the connected migration, meaning the Ukrainian refugees. And the EU needs to find internal solution for that if otherwise this entire membership process is going to remaining mostly in the symbolic domain. My last 2 points is on Ukraine and Moldova. Ukraine, how to say it nicely, just as the EU must change, internally and structurally, Ukraine is already changing. We see a large destruction in Ukraine. Now the estimates after the Khakovka dam, which is just like Nord Stream is symbolizing the abrupt end of Ostpolitik, Khakovka is also symbolizing something, this destruction, what is happening in Ukraine. And so the question is what kind of Ukraine is going to emerge on the war, how that fits into the EU, and how this interrelates between these two structural changes. But one of my main focuses also, is getting more in-depth analysis about the Ukrainian internal processes, because a lot of this, how we're watching Ukraine, is again in the lens of the war, or if you like, the lens of the Russia war in Ukraine. So one of my problem with the EU, as well as with the analytical community, colleagues here, is that as the past 20 years, Ukraine was viewed with the lens of Russia. Now Ukraine is viewed with the lens of Russia's war in Ukraine. And I don't see that there is a fundamental or qualitative difference or shift, which we would need, or we would require to, to study where the country is. And my last point, as I'm writing here, Moldova sneaks in. I do think in the current situation in Ukraine and the war impact, Moldova is the only country which actually can be integrated into the EU. Here, because of the size, because of many factors, but also because of politics, the big question for Moldova what to do is also because of the war impact so far. It seems like it's not going to reach Transnistria as well as Moldova proper, just like it's not going to reach Odessa. At least that's the situation right now. So that gives time for Moldova to focusing on Transnistria and what kind of solution Moldova can find out with the help of the international community on that. This is going to be a key test for Moldova. guess what? This is nobody dealing with this at this current situation, at least not publicly. There are tractors who are considering it. We have to happy to share more later on about this. But I do think that if the membership of the EU and the Transnistria question is going to be interlinked, then Moldova is having a chance to getting into the EU ahead of even Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have two brilliant commentators. Piotr, Buras is the first one, so please have some.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Balázs, for your excellent talk. And let me make maybe 2 points in reference to what you have just said. The first one is on this on the structural or you said situational power shift within the European Union, which I think it's an interesting phenomenon. And I would also be very cautious in describing it as a shift of center of gravity in the European Union, which is, in my opinion, I fully agree with you, it's not taking place, but it's what we could have observed over the last more than 1 year has been a shift of attention towards the East for obvious reasons, but it's, of course, it is an opportunity for the countries of Central Eastern Europe, for Poland, for the Baltic states as well, because I think what really makes up for this shift of attention towards the East is that several very important objectives of the countries of the region have moved up to the EU on the top of the EU agenda, basically, and I think there are three of them which are particularly relevant, and you referred to some of them. But I think the first one is that this idea of building security against Russia and not with Russia. I mean, this is something which the countries of the region, of course, not all of them, there are exceptions, very well known, but generally, I think in Central Eastern Europe, in the Baltic states, there has always been this desire to convince the West Europeans that we need to build our security not with Russia, but against Russia. And I think this is now no longer controversial. So this is one important shift of attention. The second one is I think on energy security, and this is something which has been always on the top of also of the Poland's agenda in the EU. Just to remind you of the idea of energy union, which Donald Tusk came up with already 2010. And now it's kind of a mainstream thinking in the EU. And the third one is, of course, enlargement. And this is we have talked a lot about enlargement, but the countries of the region have always been very much in favor of making enlargement policy a greater priority than it used to be. But that brings me to my second point on enlargement specifically, because I think what is interesting with this shift of the center or of attention towards the East is that it is on one hand, of course, a big achievement of the countries of the region that now their, so to say, topics are on the top of the agenda, but it doesn't mean by far that the answers which will be formulated at the EU level to these questions related to these three big issues will be Central and East European answers. So basically, it's this is an opportunity, but whether we have indeed enough power, enough energy, and in the end influence on the EU policy making, it's a completely open question. And that brings me to the enlargement issue, because I think this is very interesting. You said the enlargement policy is, you divided it into symbolic and tangible steps, which the EU have taken on that, and you said that this is largely symbolic in the moment, which I also agree with, even if I don't want to kind of put in question the importance of those symbolic steps, like the candidate status for Ukraine and so on. That was all needed and important. But now, of course, as we discussed it in the last panel, in the first panel actually as well, the question is how to move to the tangible policy steps. And I think this is something what exactly the countries of Central Eastern Europe should be, and especially Poland, I think, should be in the lead of. So basically, if we are serious about enlargement policy, so we cannot leave it as it is, but we need to move forward and put forward some policy ideas, some concrete steps. One of them could be, for example, what Christoph presented in the previous panel. But I think what's happening is the opposite, because we have I think three very important baskets of this enlargement policy debate in when it comes to these tangible steps. And the one is institutions, the other is agriculture, and the third one is EU budget. So unless we find answers to these three challenges, or how to revise the EU policy in these three areas, enlargement policy which addresses Ukraine will not be not only credible, but it will simply not happen. I mean, we will not have an enlargement unless we answer these three questions. Of course, as Stefan said in his intervention in the first session, perhaps the importance of the institutional reforms is overblown, which I kind of agree, but still you need to have a discussion about that, and you need to have a strategy how to address also the positions of those countries which put this issue on the agenda. And I think when I look, for example, and because I'm talking in the context of your remarks about the center of gravity and so on. So Poland is, of course, the country which is supposed to be the new leader in a way in this framework of the shift of gravity. So the Polish position is basically that we shouldn't talk about institutional reforms at all. So basically, the QMV is absolutely against, and there's no way to discuss it. There is on agriculture. As you know, we had or still have this grain crisis where Poland basically is in favor of reintroducing tariffs on Ukrainian grain, and it's fighting hard in Brussels to achieve its goals basically at the expense of the Ukrainian interests, including, for example, blackmailing the EU with this post-Cotonou agreement, which is a very important agreement regulating the cooperation between the EU and African countries. Poland is blocking this agreement, blackmailing the EU with the aim to get concessions on agriculture and more money and more basically options to block the transit and import of Ukrainian grain. And this is so. It shows how important this issue is, because unless we find a solution to that, all talk about Ukraine's accession is completely ridiculous, basically. And the same is true for the EU budget, which has been raised by Balázs and Duke, that in the current form is basically cannot be adapted to most probably to the Ukraine's membership. And I'm saying that because, and this last point, and I would like to come back to the idea I mentioned before, that I'm saying that because it is really extremely urgent. Because the multi-annual financial framework of the EU, the next one, which is going to start 2028, it needs to be discussed and negotiated basically now. I mean, starting just after the EP election, there will be the discussion in full steam. so we need to, and unless we decided how to adapt these policies, this political idea of having enlargement 2030 or 2029, giving any dates, but there is this political ambition we are talking about that every time and then, that maybe 2030, this is the perspective, but it's that would then require additional negotiations just before the accession. I think this is simply not realistic, and even in the scenario which Christoph painted, the accession to single market plus EU funds, you would have to solve this problem. So that's why, once again, my very strong insistence on the need of a quite a concrete, if not planned, then at least analysis and political discussion now, basically in the next 2 years, and the Warsaw kind of agenda. Warsaw, because Poland will have the EU presidency 2025 in the first half of the year. To make this debate about future enlargement more down to earth, because at the moment, indeed, this is very, very symbolic and not tangible. Thank you.
I was just taking some notes on your paper. So excellent point, food for thought for the discussion and the reality check on what's going on, and compliments to Balázs. Having read it very briefly, but also listening to your notes, and we had this brief conversation earlier. I understand my task a little bit also to also nudge the discussion, maybe in some other directions related to what you were saying. Part of our work back in Visegrad Insight on the similar topic, the future of neighborhood enlargement, is also induced by Miro Lajcak's remarks we had when on consulting what would be useful for the EU institutions, and basically asked us to prepare a cost of non-enlargement. And I think it's a valid question as well, in the light of what you were saying, what is not possible, but if it doesn't happen, what then? That's another angle to think about it, and not necessarily because we want it not to happen. I still think you can imagine enlargement happening, but you need to imagine enlargement not happening to mobilize new resources, action, and political force for that. In that context, I think there are two elements that and I think you're at least in one topic much more knowledgeable than I am to be mentioned. It's not just Ukraine, but it's Belarus. Because the future of what will happen in Belarus, and the second element, what will happen to Russia, is inherently, it's not just Ukraine, but it's the whole space, and of course there are other countries. So we're not limiting ourselves, I think, in this analysis to the so-called Eastern Partnership framework, but it's all of the countries that are neighboring to the EU. I have no answers to that, but I'm just flagging it simply because I think it's important. In a very simplistic way, the part of the analysis in Poland, again, I think there is a consensus that Piotr can contradict that, but that there are two ways. Either Lukashenko goes first and then we have no Belarus, or Putin goes first and then there is a chance, but not necessarily a future for some change in Belarus. But this is as important as everything here, because that ultimately projects on the chances of Ukraine succeeding, and also for EU to deliver in a time perspective, which is hard to predict, because it's a war situation and things happen sudden, or they may take forever. We should be probably prepared for a forever war, war, meaning that Russia, by losing, and it has been on the losing side, it has been going down in its power in relative terms for a number of years already, and its foreseeable future is going down demographically, economically, we see it militarily.
this will only they will only induce it to assert its global position by projecting chaos. So even if there is some ceasefire or frozen conflict, it will be increasingly unstable country for exactly Europe's neighborhood, not only EU itself. And I think that needs to be part of the analysis. I mean, that needs to be part of this thinking, but that sets also the gravity of the situation straight. Now, given the context of Eastern Partnership, countries and neighborhoods, and enlargement, I have not so much to add, but I would just stress how important these countries of EU and NATO reaction has been and will be. Center of gravity, I agree. There's much more of a political narrative, especially from center-right or right-wing government, because that's also Czech narrative, about having, center of gravity. And to a certain extent, I agree it's not. It's not delivering also because the type of political leadership doesn't have the skill set, the network actually to build higher. But you can imagine that after EP elections, it will be different. You can also, in next year, and you can also imagine that it will be different with a different president in the US. Now, should there be that kind of perspective ahead of us with unstable and chaotic Russia, willing to commit bigger acts of terrorism and crime, and everybody getting a little bit tired of that, but still the pressure growing. Countries of Central Eastern Europe are only going to double on what they're doing. Should there be a change of government in Poland, which I definitely hope so and wish for, we will only see doubling on this window of next 18 months, during which we don't have, for sure, President Trump. And then we will see. And that means that a potential new government in Poland will only double on the spending and buying American, which will create rifts within the EU. Further rifts than we have seen that already in the past, that how this was inducing a lot of misunderstanding between the Polish and the French, and any effort to come on common European response and foreign policy will have a divisive moment, because Poland will be trying hard to basically secure its position and manifest that while we are, of course, European and restoring democracy, the main thing is that we need to have something to defend ourselves, and we need to contract that as much as we can while we can, before we don't know what's going to happen in the next time after US elections. And I think the last point, and Piotr also touched on this multi-annual financial framework will partly fall onto the Polish presidency in the EU 2025. We don't know how successful it will be, because we don't know how the EU elections will go, how messy it will be, whether we will have a commission by the end of the year, and many other things. But then there will be also Danish presidency, and it will reinforce also the 2 points that you mentioned. One is the opposition to the reform of institutional reform, and especially the consensus vote on CSDP, because the initiators of the non-paper on no reforms during the war were actually, I think, Danish, if not someone from the Nordics, that put on board everyone else in Central, or most of the countries in Central Eastern Europe, except I think Hungary. So that's definitely coming there, and the multi-annual financial framework will definitely fall into this discussion. I think it's critical, but why I am mentioning it here again, it's not so much about the costs that we're gonna have to find out how to bear with regarding support for Ukraine. It will be an increasing pressure on how we are actually rebuilding Central Eastern Europe. And the focus on Central Eastern Europe for now is not so much, again, because of the war. Poland is having some new investment and economy going well, but actually in most of our countries, and just look at Slovakia, the main thing and the main message is what is it for us? What is it in it for us? And unless there is a real delivery on economy, on the economic policies and the money in these countries, we might be quite surprised by the turning tide, not coming from the core European countries, but also from Central Eastern Europe, on the questions that are so important for the future of Europe in the context of Ukraine and further east.
Okay, thank you very much. If you allow me 1 minute to shot some more information into this debate. Your last question, what is there in it for us? And you mentioned the Slovaks. Looking up the most recent Eurobarometer data, supporting or not supporting, more or less supporting the support for the Ukraine. Slovakia is the 27th out of 27 countries, and it's the only one except for Greece, who, where the majority of the population is against, is not satisfied with the support for the Ukraine. Greece also, Czech Republic is already slightly positive, but only very little. Some other countries, Hungary, Bulgaria, Slovenia, Austria, among the least supportive ones. When we look compared to the Netherlands, Ireland, Finland, all the Scandinavian countries, the Baltic countries, and so on, you have support between 82 and over 90%, as against 45%. So this is an explosive. I mean, if you look at it more closely, and Germany and Romania are, so to speak, in the middle of this scale, but there is a very significant part of the population who is highly sensitive and could, I do not say overnight, but could, there's a shifting preferences. I printed out another table also from the Eurobarometer, and it seems to correlate very highly with another, which is whether populations are satisfied or not, keep EU membership as very important or not important at all. And if you have a saldo out of the two, you have again the same ranking, so to speak. The last ones in this case is Bulgaria, Czech Republic, and Slovakia again, and then Austria already, the fourth last of all the countries within the European Union. And again, you have, Latvia, Ireland, Luxembourg, who are most, positive. So I think we should keep this in mind. We should also, when we look as a sociologist, as a social scientist, I look less at the institutional processes, but more at the outcomes. The outcomes, when we see, for instance, the differences, Russia compared to the Western countries. There's a famous Hungarian historian, comparative historian, István Bernd, who is now in the University of UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, who was the president, I think, of the Academy of Science in Hungary, who compared from 1870, after the First World War, after the Second World War, 89, with the fall of the communism, and now 23, the standards of living, technological advances, demographic decomposition, differences, standard of living. For instance, I was not aware that at the end of the Soviet Empire, the standard of living in Russia was 40% of the Western, if you, make up for the differences in exchange rate. But if you take this into account, 40%. Now we are down to 21%, which is basically halving the gap between the Western. And so he gives many other examples of the relative deprivation of and what is, so to speak, what are the driving forces maybe behind this very aggressive. Then, of course, the whole question of what I could call politics of the womb, this Gebärpolitik, this kind of very aggressive natalist policies where you have the motherhood medals and motherhood heroes and motherhood I don't know what, and you get 1 million ruble, and 1 million ruble, supposedly inflation proof, is now down to $11,000, but still it's $11,000. Yesterday I heard that destroying a tank by a soldier, a Russian soldier in Ukraine, gets you also 1 million ruble. So raising 10 children up to 10th birthday, because only then you get this motherhood capital, your motherhood here. is about worst destroying one tank, but it must be a Leopard, a German Leopard tank. No other tanks are counted into this kind of bonification. So you ask yourself, what is going on? What the crazy environment are we in, and why is the timeline so different, in a warlike situation as against the normal, quote-unquote, business as usual procedures, where we learned this morning it can take 10, 15 years, what for others takes 2 years or 2 weeks or 1 week. Okay, sorry for the... Amanda, please, and then...
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I just have a comment, and then I'd like your thoughts on my comment. So the first thing I wanted to say is that I totally agree that there isn't like a shift east, that it's a solutional shift east. And also I think it's a shift of discovery for Western Europe. And I think that's very much like representative in Macron's kind of early few lines in Bratislava when he said, "I'm glad to have made it all the way to Bratislava." It's not actually that far away, but I think it was kind of representative of how he sees kind of where Slovakia is and where the region is and how far away it is for him. I think like a common approach when we look at the implications of the Russo-Ukrainian war, when looking at Eastern Europe, is that kind of internationally we tend to bunch Eastern Europe all in together as if kind of everyone speaks with one voice. And I think that that's not the best way to do it. I think there is taking Hungary aside, there is one unifying factor, and that's the Russian threat. But then when you break it down into its component parts, it's like completely different. So like to me in Poland, you always have like defending democracy abroad, but at home it's a completely different situation. And I think there needs to be a more rigorous investigation into how the EU is dealing with the rule of law crisis and the war in Ukraine. Because right now, it really feels like they're falling between two stools. Then in Czechia, you have a government that basically has no teeth, and you have a society that's completely distrusting of the government. And for that, you just have to look at the Disinformation Commission, for example, and that they eroded the post because they believed that the Czech voters en masse believed that this was a threat to freedom, and they don't trust the government. In Slovakia, I think the upcoming elections are going to be super interesting about what that says about the Slovak position. Hungary, well, Hungary is Hungary, unfortunately, but it definitely shows how isolated Orban is. And also, where is the V4? It's kind of marked like the death of the V4, as so to speak. I know it was kind of interesting to hook it as kind of Orban's big project, but I suppose that one kind of structure for a unified voice for the region, for Central Europe, is somewhat no more. And look, we could go on and on and on. Then when it comes to Moldova, which you brought up, I totally agree that I think that its accession will be easier for numerous reasons. One of all is basically just the use of the Romanian language for one, so the translation work is all done. The amount of Moldovan citizens that have EU passports is just another. But I'd love your thoughts and Tom's tomorrow's on the Transnistrian question, because for me, the position of Transnistria has been fascinating about how it's traditionally balanced since 2008. When was the accession agreement? 2000. When was the EU accession, or not EU trade agreement with Moldova? 2016. Hello. And they have balanced Moscow and Brussels particularly well, and for me it seems like somewhat of a litmus test. On Belarus, I think if Lukashenko dies, Kokhanova is the one that will immediately take over, while Moscow works to bring on, to kind of elect another leader. If there's some sort of coup within the regime, it's going to be controlled by Moscow. So I think it's fair to say that the exiled opposition doesn't stand a chance. And I think the argument that, oh, well, look at Poland, it was dock workers from Gdansk brought down, you know, like led the move for change. I don't think Moscow is going to allow that either. So those are my comments, if I can be so rude. I generally thoroughly dislike people who give rambling comments, so I have to take myself to the dock. But yeah, I just wanted your thoughts on basically how the Western Europe sees Eastern Europe, and actually is Western Europe still looking at Eastern Europe with this old othered gaze of that the region moves as one and works as one?
Thank you, Balázs. Great presentation. Thank you very much. A question and a comment, or trying to put something on your radar. The question is, can you run me through this thing that you said that the cap is an impediment to Ukraine's integration? It's related to the comment, trying to put something on your radar. COP27 gave technically the entire world a mandate to review food systems. Within the Green Deal, the farm to fork policy was supposed to change the way in which Europe does agriculture and food security. Nothing was done. And they don't know how they're going to move into the next commission and how they're going to approach the agricultural question. But the agricultural question is now brought under strategic light because obviously Ukraine is one of the places where the future of food security is going to play out as a result of its black soil. And it's the future of food security also against Russia in a world where Russia essentially tries to weaponize food supply chains and agricultural supply chains. So there is a shift essentially which is very structural, where Ukraine, like the agricultural potential of Ukraine is one of the reasons why Ukraine is so important to the European Union, which therefore will revert back into a question as to how the EU needs to change the CAP. Because as it is constructed today, the CAP will spell the demise of the EU if it doesn't adapt towards more complex agricultural systems, et cetera, et cetera. So if you had time in your comments, great to answer this. Otherwise, I'd love to speak afterwards.
Thank you so much.
Hi there. Yes, Balázs, really interesting presentation. I'd like to sort of continue the Moldova theme, because on the one hand, I think we can all agree with you that Moldova is smaller and easier, an easier candidate for EU accession. But there's a kind of big if for me, which is the next election, a problem that, you know, I think we're not going to see a big change of course in Ukraine with the next election, but we could see, you know, you could call them unlucky because they've just stewarding Moldova through this period of crisis. But you could see that the current pro-European government, which they suddenly they have the government, they have the parliament, they have the presidency. You could see them losing at least one of those in the next election in Moldova. So there's a kind of Moldova-specific question there, which is, you know, what can be done before then to kind of consolidate an EU perspective for Moldova. And there's a kind of more general question, I guess, for this enlargement debate, which is we're looking at an enlargement debate which is longer than electoral cycles in these countries, and there's something problematic there, that you can start a process and it can be quite promising for Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and yet potentially, and indeed the Balkans, but potentially an election can upset that process and throw everything off track.
Thanks for excellent presentations. Balázs, I would be grateful if you could somehow relate the scenarios for the future conduct of the war to this enlargement perspective. Because I think under the best case scenario, if the Ukraine wins and expels Russian troops from its territory, then doesn't need to join the EU, right? It could become some kind of a Turkey major player on its own, one of the strongest armies in Europe. If it's defeated, of course, then the question of enlargement doesn't really, is in a way solved, I would say. But the most likely scenario is sort of in between, right? The counter-offensive will liberate some more territory, eventually it will get stuck, right? And then I think there will be a strong interest also on the other side of the Atlantic, somehow to lower the level of violence and somehow so semi-freeze the process. And at the same time, there will be a huge political need to reassure that Ukraine could survive as a viable state. And I think probably at this stage, the war will not be over. NATO membership will not be on the table. It will be, there is a perspective. There could be a massive push to drive forward the EU enlargement much more quickly than anybody anticipates, actually, or wishes at this stage. I remember very well, I talked to someone who participated in the European Council debate, or who was in the room on candidate status, and prior to that, there was almost a majority of member states who were deeply skeptical, didn't want to give candidate status, but confronted with the fact that denying this to Ukraine would be a massive boost to Vladimir Putin, they had to do it. So I could well imagine that there is sort of a political necessity to do something quite important and quite dynamically in order to ensure this future viability of the surviving part of the Ukraine that will lead to solutions that we might not anticipate. I think it's sort of a dynamic that takes its own path.
Thanks for your presentation, Balázs. I really liked how you laid out the changing conjuncture around the end of Ostpolitik and the Washington Consensus. And my question is, has anyone told the candidate countries that neoliberalism is over? And so the context for this question, I guess, has been engagement with Ukraine over the last year or so. Over the last 5 weeks, we've been running this short course for Ukrainian civil servants at the LSE, which was really quite exciting and fun. But we were in the peculiar position of being Western intellectuals, trying to tell them not to take the Western path of development and adopt a developmental state strategy. So, and we got a hearing, but I wouldn't say that the assumptions that we were putting forward, I'd say, seemed pretty surprising to them. So I'm just wondering how that reality fits with this shifting conjuncture, because it introduces quite a powerful element of fragmentation, I think, into the picture, where neoliberalism is ending in some contexts with the rise of this more securitized development framework, but persisting in many others.
Okay, any more statements? If not, Balázs, you have the final word.
Yes, thank you. Let me start with the last one, and then I try to address very quickly all. Absolutely, the Washington Consensus is fully alive and kicking in Ukraine. Unfortunately, if you read, the EU always considered the biggest reform achievement the so-called macroeconomic stabilization of Ukraine. What does it actually mean? Is that Ukraine has been provided a lot of short-term loans, first by the IFIs, the international financial institutions, and then by the biggest investment banks. And these are short-term and pays extremely well. That was the so-called macroeconomic stabilization. Meanwhile, if you look also, most of, I think 60%, if I'm not mistaken, the Ukrainian support or aid is credit, right? To the extent that it is quite obvious, and this is one of the problems for the EU, because the EU is using the so-called MFA, the macrofinance assistance. Of this, the first rule is that the actual country which the EU is lending has to be capable to pay back. So I'm not even going to raise whether the EU keeps its own rules when it comes to providing support for Ukraine. I'm politically fully backing it, but there is no mechanism, fortunately, or using the mechanism it has. Now, what you don't hear in the Ukrainian Recovery Conference or anywhere else is debt relief. There is no debt relief for Ukraine, for its Western creditors. And to be frank, we can discuss the Ukrainian Recovery Conference. The main emphasis was the private sector will pay for it. Great. What actually we need in Ukraine for the private sector to coming in? The word which we can't use when it comes to Ukraine, and that word is peace. There is no way private investors will come in until peace. A credible, justified, whatever the terminology is, we need to be a settlement. The war has to stop. Then recovery, private investment, and anything else comes in. I think the same goes to the EU membership. And not only for the NATO, but for the EU in the long run. The longer the war is, the bigger the destruction is, and the farther we actually, the farther the symbolic measures of the EU membership process is going to be kept. We don't talk about it. It doesn't mean that this doesn't exist. For a full-term membership perspective, both in NATO and EU, again, we need a settlement, which we as far from it as exactly because I also think that so far, the current situation, it points into a stalemate. And even if Ukraine would be win against Russia, which let's hope, but even then we cannot avoid the destruction of certain part of Ukraine and, including the military capabilities. Which of, next point, Peskov was bragging about demilitarization is happening, which I think a lot of people will think that, okay, this is a clear sign from Moscow for potential talks. I don't think so. I think what Peskov means is that to a certain extent demilitarization is happening of the Ukrainian army, meaning it was, even after a lot of corruption and neglect in the past 30 years, Ukraine has the second biggest European army after Russia. In terms of capabilities, Soviet-era systems, air defense, air force, artillery. And so that is largely gone after 16 months of the war. And it has been mostly replaced by Western weapon systems. It's a question whether, for example, Ukraine has been remarkable in the past 16 months when it comes to protecting the air with Soviet systems or Soviet Russia-made systems, not by us. This is why the F-16s and all this are coming incredibly important, not for the Air Force, but for the air defense. Because the Western air defense is we sending up the jets and they shutting down the missiles or the drones. So that's why Ukraine needs the F-16s. So in a lot of ways, yes, these are trends which are unfortunately happening, and we have to take into account when it comes to, for me, so far abstract, because the EU membership is still abstract, no matter whether Ukraine is going to get the membership. So Ukraine, if the war is going to be long, then Ukraine is going to be a frontline country with all the economic, social, military, security, etc., underpinning it means. That doesn't point toward an EU membership process or recovery process. The country is already divided by demographically, the IDPs, the refugees, and all this. You can see that already from the southeast people, and the Khakovka dam destruction is just going to be reinforcing that. I mean, all these big cities, Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, less extent Dnipro, but Kherson, these are not going to be inhabited because there's nothing else to do but to fight. It's not for the ordinary civilians. So going to see, these changes in demography and structurally and so on. So that's, one of the key topic for me as well as I think for the EU is what kind of Ukraine we're going to have emerging from this. What kind of Ukraine we want to integrate, okay? Because I think the debate shouldn't be, and I'm going to pull out Natalie, I fully agree. Like, we need to emphasize that we don't have a choice. We have to integrate Ukraine. I'm gonna say it. I told a few of you. You know, there is this the first rule of the porcelain shop. If you break it, you own it. That's why I think we are in the breaking point. We need to understand as well. But so let me now address the Moldova. Yes, and so. You know, one of the things out of this process, if and it's a big if, we'll see how the offensive goes, how the war goes, but if that's kind of happening in Ukraine, then Moldova is really the case where we can have. By the way, it's also, Tom, we are nowhere near in elections in Ukraine, because even for elections, the war must stop, right? And so, you know, in Moldova, yes, I mean, I'm not worried that much about the elections, simply because if you look at the opposition, they're in a bigger disarray than the Sandu part, or the pro-Europeans. I don't like this terminology, but let's call it like that. Simply because if you eliminate Shor, who has been just eliminated by the Constitutional Court earlier this week, then you have the socialists, the communists, and somewhere in between, which, you know, even the communists remember 10, 15 years ago was the so-called famous pro-European communist. So I don't think it's going to be a major challenge. If there's a credible integration process, then it's going to be a major challenge. Transnistria, economically, is already integrated exactly because of this silent memorandum type of integration, fascinating innovation, by the way. How that happened, and it was one of the greatest things in the past 15 years that happened, or 10 years, in the integration front. So that is the main question: is how are you gonna tackle and settle this Transnistrian crisis? And frankly, this is why my impression that that's what the Sandu government and the entourage is kind of very afraid to do. Instead, they're doing this soft Romanization, you know, and to keeping certain part of the electoral segment happy. But unless, and that's why the EU needs to be very much, Germany and the rest, very much, you know, either or. It's not possible without, there is a, you know, the Russia is far away, even though they have these 15 peacekeepers, so-called, you know. What is the peaceful resolution? What is the political solution for this? And that's what needs to be emphasized. The Belarus, I actually particularly didn't mention Belarus because of the time, but also because I think Belarus is gone. And there's no matter what we're going to do, there was a chance until the elections of 2020. And at dinner, I can tell you a few stories about all this, what happened, but this is where we lost the chance to actually, look, Belarus, luring Belarus would require to agree with the Lukashenko legacy. And that's the EU cannot do, mostly because of Poland and Lithuania, let's face it. And, you know, it just doesn't fit into the value-based foreign policy and all this. So that's what Russia utilized a lot. You know, the Belarus balcony has been key, both for security as well as in other, you know, Belarus industrial capacity is also something which Russia is utilizing now to full. And Belarus essentially is trying to balance now the Russian relationship with China. We are no longer there. And that's also something for the EU to reconsider, I think, because it's not in our interest that we shouldn't be on the other side of the border by now, but still. So, yeah. More in the evening about this. Internal reform. There is this French-German working group which is addressing the internal reform. And I think the Macron speech, Bratislava, not only Pierre Vimont wrote about it for Carnegie. You know, it was essentially we accepting the shift over the East when it comes to securitization of the EU. Now you have to accept, as a compromise, the internal reform. I think that was the Macron speech. First and foremost message, let's make a compromise, we agree on this. War with Russia, I mean, not war, but, you know, security against Russia, as I think Piotr, you said. But then we have to change the internal rules. That means that the Central and Eastern European member states will have less. Again, you know, it's not going to be consensual, it's going to be, and that's, by the way, also the only way to integrate more member states. Ukraine, You know, there are obviously other things as well, because just to consider Ukraine and Poland has a blocking minority, would have been a blocking minority, right? So we are far away from this. So the agriculture, absolutely. I'm not a cap, very far from the cap, but I think the grain deal and all this around, you know, that is exactly what's the reality behind the rhetoric. We want to support Ukraine, but we cannot accept the grain at the current circumstances because the markets are such that it's unfortunately running against the biggest lobby in Europe. It's the agricultural lobby, the Poles, the Dutch, and you name it. So, and that also needs to be part of the internal reform process. It's going to be very painful. I don't think it's going to be, it needs to be quick. My problem with the Commission is similarly, it's really the gap between the rhetoric and reality. Just give you one example. Yesterday, von der Leyen, Commission President, was saying, we're going to make Russia pay. When it comes to recovery, and we're going to do something with the assets. The EU own legal opinion, it's not possible to do. So there's a clear conflict between the EU's own legal opinion as well as what the president is saying. What's going to be stronger, I don't know. I don't think the EU will be able to do, but that's also going back to the same thing. Where is the resource behind recovery and reconstruction, particularly if no taxpayers' money could be committed at the circumstances? There is not enough EU budget for the normal things, as it turned out from last week, when the Commission has to turn to member states asking for more money because the current budget is done, also broken in that process. Another breaking point, the EU budget. So, in a lot of things, the US is changing, they're shifting, the economic consensus, the Washington consensus is changing, and the EU is doubling down. Simply because of the lack of process, we are stuck with, the war and the consequences the most. The US is clearly on a reindustrialization period. Every indicator is for that. The Germans so far is saying we have a cost problem. They don't use the word deindustrialization, but we have a cost problem. But the actual subsidies structure, the differences, the energy price differences are such big that for long term, if this is going to be the case, that obviously is going to be, the US is going to have a big advantage. And I think it's going to have negative impact for the EU to do. And that's also one of the things which, Piotr, you mentioned these three things, agriculture, internal reform, I would say the industries, and what to do with the industries, the energy security and all these issues, which I'm also not an expert, but these are a key part of that process. Public opinion and Slovakia. I'm from Slovakia, so it's kind of, it's a very multi-layer issue. Why the Slovaks coming up in the public opinion polls like that? Obviously, 19th century Slovak nationalist traditions is very pan-Slavic, right? It's one of them. These ideas are still, this is what every Slovak is going to be taught in school, and so on and so on. Obviously part of it. Another part of it, that this very pro-Ukrainian position or policy was made by a very unpopular, chaotic, in the end incompetent government coalition. Okay? And so a lot of Slovaks are saying no or niet to this, not only to Ukraine or the Ukraine policy change. And we have a former Prime Minister Fico, who is, because of personal motivation, revenge, right, is willing to pick up the Ukrainian opposition ball and run with it. I do think that all this urbanization and all this speech are grossly exaggerated because Fico is not bringing anything like what Orban was doing structurally. He may win the election. He may probably not going to capable to form a government coalition. But Fico's track record as prime minister was always pragmatic. Whatever Slovak elite's consensus was, essentially, he never really turned against it. He was rallying against the euro, and then when he was elected, he actually adopted the euro. And so on and so on. I'm not saying that he's going to make a U-turn if, it's a big if, is going to be the prime minister, but we are far from him being a prime minister, and we are even further that he would make a U-turn when it comes to, even to a policy like that. The maximum when it comes to this is like, I promise I'm not going to give more Slovak weapons to Ukraine. Well, Slovakia has no more weapons for Ukraine, so it's a very easy to promise to make and to fulfill. But the public opinion also, and my last point on this, is I still think this is remarkable that if you actually take a look at the polls in Europe-wide, when it comes to solidarity or support for Ukraine, it's incredibly high still, and pretty much everywhere. So you have these two layers. We are tired of the war, right? But we want to support Ukraine. So you have this two-dimensional thinking, and even those Slovaks who are saying we want peace, right? They don't think in terms of, I was trying to explain to Oksana today, they don't think in terms of this is pro-Russian position. They're just tired of the war, of the inflation, whatever, they connect it to the war impact. So it's a bit of a different thing. So Russia, which remains my last point, and then I'm returning to the breaking point. There was a very interesting article by Max Samorukov at Foreign Policy about Putin motivation. And Samorukov argued something which I thought about earlier, that, Putin's, they started the war not merely from, imperialistic motives, but by transforming Russia. The oligarchic post-Yeltsin Russia he inherited, and he tried to turn around, but he couldn't because there's a lot of obstacles. And now he's using the war, so he's actually incentivized to have a longer war or a longer conflict. Samorukov explains exactly because partly of this transformation desire. Whether it's going to be happening or not, this is an open question. I don't know. I'm not focusing on that much, but certainly the desire and the opportunity Putin sees, and I think this is one of the things which he aims. So going back, again, I do think we're in the breaking point for the EU. It needs to be structural change, internal. For Ukraine, what kind of Ukraine we're going to have emerging out of the war, and how we're going to address those, and what's going to be how we're going to move really the enlargement process, which is back, also breaking the old consensus. And I think one of my last articles, because I joined the Foreign Service in 2019, was that the Eastern Partnership neighboring policy is lost in the trenches of Donbass. So now we can say that the war killed it. And for the EU, it would be better to come up with something new, very much based on the reality and not on the status quo, what we have in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Despite the efforts to speed up, in the end we did not succeed in this, but Ivan grants us another 15 minutes of break, and please be back at past so that we can finish with half an hour too late and not more.